Our topic for today is going to be bioaccumulation and biomagnification. I didn't do fill in the blank notes for these because the note isn't very long, so you'll have to take notes down onto a piece of paper. All right, so the first topic is, or the first word is bioaccumulation. So basically bio means living, if you remember that. Accumulation means to gather stuff. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be gathering stuff in living organisms. So this is the gathering of substances. Now they can be good substances or they can be bad substances into an organism. All right, so the accumulation, which is the gradual gathering of substances transferring from the environment into an organism. And these can be things such as, for example, nutrients. So if you've got a fish that's eating plants, it's taking in the nutrients from those plants, it's using it to build muscle, it's using it to reproduce, it's using the nutrients to produce energy, to swim around. So the nutrients are really, really important. But it can also take in any toxins that might be in that plant life. It can take in some pesticides that might be around there. We can have organic and inorganic compounds that may be in the water as well, and it'll gather those over time as well. The more and more it eats the plants. And we can be looking at some elements such as mercury and any other type of pollutants that may be in the water. Right? So over time, as that fish is eating, it's keeping some of these things in the flesh, in their bodies. So for bioaccumulation to happen, we have to get substances from the environment into that organism. So the substances get from the environment into an organism. And then from being in one organism, a higher level organism can also eat that one. And that's how that secondary consumer end up with toxins or nutrients or whatever in their flesh. So how do the substances from the environment get into the original organism? Right, so sometimes it can be food intake. So the organisms can eat something from the environment that contains a substance. So if it's a small fish that's eating plant life, maybe the plant life has a gathering of toxins on them. And then the little fish eats it and builds up the toxins into their flesh. They can also, or organisms can inhale it. So through respiration by breathing it in. And we'll get to a little story about mercury and breathing it in when we get later on talk about mercury. And finally, we can get toxins building up into our bodies through skin contact, which is why with certain chemicals you have to wear protective covering so that you don't have that chemical going onto your skin and then entering your body. Alrighty. So here's an example of a pesticide, DDT, that was around after, I think, the Second World War. DDT is one of those toxins that has done great good and also like great bad. All right, it's one reason today why we don't have bed bugs running rampant through all our homes, because bed bugs really were running rampant through people's homes way back when. And what households did is they would just spray the DDT onto their beds, onto their furniture, and kill all the bed bugs. Gone. Areas were able to really cut back on malaria outbreaks because they could just spray the DDT and then end up killing all the mosquitoes. Now, unfortunately, there's some mosquitoes in developing countries that have developed an immunity to DDT, so the DDT doesn't even work there as well as it used to anymore. Alrighty, but it also caused a whole lot of problems in wildlife down the road, which we'll talk about. I think there's a diagram coming up with it. Okay, another one. Here's a naturally occurring element. So the things like pesticides, DDT, are human-made, so they're made in a laboratory. But you can also have elements that are naturally occurring. So this is kind of the joke when people talk about, all natural foods or foods with no chemicals in them or whatever it is. Nature has enough of its poisons on its own. Things that are all natural can also kill you. So it's kind of a little marketing scam when people talk about things being chemical free or having or made of all natural ingredients. So something that's naturally occurring is something like mercury. And mercury, even in low concentrations, can cause problems. And they basically say the safe amount of mercury is no amount of mercury. Same with lead. The safe amount of lead is no amount of lead. So very low concentrations of these naturally occurring elements are toxic and poisonous. All right, so we can have human produced chemicals, and we can have naturally produced chemicals that are just here. Okay, so contrast that, or not contrast that, but our next step is biomagnification. So in biomagnification, this is where our food chain really comes into play, because what happens is the toxin or the pollutant, whatever it is, builds up as you go up the food chain. So the substances such as pollutants become concentrated as you move up the food chain. So I alluded to this a little bit earlier when I talked about the littler fish being eaten by a bigger fish, and that bigger fish getting some of the pollutants from the little one. But you figure a bigger fish has to eat a lot of those little fish, so it's getting the toxins from all those little fish. All right, if we remember that energy passes through the food chain and it's lost as you move up the food pyramid. So as you move up, you're losing energy, which means you need to eat more things. So if you were eating one little fish for dinner, that probably wouldn't be enough fish for you. Just pretend it's a little one. I know there's some big fish you can eat for dinner, fill you up quite well. But if you would probably eat 2 or 3 little fish, and you would get all the toxins from those 2 or 3 little fish. Okay, so the level of toxins and harmful substances increase as you move up the food pyramid, right? So because energy is lost, you need to eat more of those organisms at the lower levels, which means that you get all those toxins from the lower levels. And that's called biomagnification, because it magnifies the amount of toxins in each organism as you go up the food pyramid or as you go along the food chain. So as you can see here on this diagram, it's a little bit small, but you can see here with DDT, there's DDT in the water that was taken up by the zooplankton. So zooplankton are small water organisms that swim around, and they're going to be taking in a lot of water and gathering the DDT in their flesh. And then you're going to have small fish that are going to have to eat a lot of these zooplankton, and they're going to build up the toxins in their little bodies. And then the larger fish are going to be eating a whole bunch of these small fish. Alrighty, and then finally we get the osprey, the top carnivore or the top predator, the top of the food chain, that's going to be eating these large fish, and they're going to eat a number of large fish in order to get their energy requirements. So you can see here, if we were to be able to measure the amount of DDT in each little zooplankton, so one little zooplankton would have this many parts per million of DDT, and then as we go up the food chain, you see how much DDT is in the top carnivore here, and it's, you know, way higher. It's magnified as you've gone up the food chain. So that's biomagnification. It's the magnification of toxins as you go up the food chain into the higher organisms. Okay, so if we take a look at bioaccumulation and biomagnification, just to see what the two definitions mean, they both describe the increase of the amount of a substance in an organism. Alrighty, but bioaccumulation occurs within a single organism. So when we're talking about something about bioaccumulating, we're talking about you accumulating into your own body. So you yourself, if you're going to eat a whole pile of mercury-laden fish, the mercury would build up in your system. You would bioaccumulate that mercury. Right? And if we look at biomagnification, it occurs across the trophic levels. So the fish that you've been eating were eating smaller fish that ate the grasses or whatever it was that had, or the plants, the water plants that had the toxins in them. So it's built up as you've gone up the food chain. So here's another little example of the DDT. All right, one of the things that happened with it, like I said, it was used as a pesticide to kill off insects such as mosquitoes or bed bugs or any other lice, anything like that. They would spray prisoners of war with DDT to cut down the amount of lice in the prisoner of war camps. So anyway, so we've got the water, the zooplankton, small fish, larger fish, and then birds of prey, or our top carnivores here. And what's ending up happening was the shells got very, very, very thin, and they broke really, really easily. So the little birds weren't hatching. They were actually like going down in numbers because they were never able to hatch these eggs, because as soon as they sat on them, the little eggs would break and the little chicks obviously wouldn't be developing. The other thing is, when they did have some of the birds that did hatch, their bills were misshapen, so they couldn't actually eat properly, so they would just starve to death. So this is why the number of birds of prey, this is one of those things that they're all happy when they see large birds of prey, because they know that they're recovering from their poisoning over the years. Okay, here's another one, mercury in fish. Now, mercury is, you know, if you have a volcano, bam, you're releasing mercury into the atmosphere. If you're burning coal, you're releasing mercury into the atmosphere. If you're mining, you're putting mercury into the atmosphere. If you're building hydroelectric dams, what you're doing is you're causing bioaccumulation of mercury in those big lakes that you'd be forming that normally you'd have smaller amounts of mercury that get flushed through the system a lot quicker. So there's both human-caused mercury poisoning, and there's naturally causing mercury poisoning or mercury in the environment. But what happens here when you've got a lot of mercury, you've got the fish absorbing mercury really efficiently. Now, this is not elemental mercury, so that silver mercury that you'll see in thermometers and stuff that's still around. I'm not saying that's the greatest thing, but if you were to, don't swallow it, but if you were to swallow it, a lot of times nothing will happen to you. It'll just pass right back out you. But what happens sometimes, there's some organisms that are really good at taking that mercury and making it bioavailable, which means it links it with a methyl group and causes it to become methyl mercury. And methyl mercury is something that your body takes up really, really easily, right? Your body knows what to do with that. So fish, when the mercury from the mines or whatever were flushed into the water, a lot of times it was in the form of methyl mercury, and small organisms were, you know, really able to take it up. Like our krill, our little zooplankton, were able to take it up, and then you'll have your smaller fish that can take it up really easily. The bigger fish is going to eat that, and then the bigger fish are going to eat that. And this is one of the reasons why they suggest that children and women of childbearing age really reduce the amount of fish that certain types of fish that they eat. So for example, tuna, you should really steer clear of albacore and white tuna when you're in your developmental years, and also if you're pregnant, because it tends to have more mercury in it. Light tuna is a lot better to eat if you have to eat tuna. Salmon, these kind of things that are lower down on the food chain are a lot better to eat than things that are higher up on the food chain, because they tend to absorb a lot more mercury. Okay, so larger fish eat many small fish and build up higher levels of mercury. And some fish have been banned for consumption because they present a toxic risk. So sometimes you'll see signs that say sport fishing only, which just means like fishing for fun. You know, get it, measure it, win a prize, whatever it is, and throw it back. And you really shouldn't be eating that kind of fish because it can be toxic. And even in our whole lake system, if you go through the guide to eating fish, you'll see it'll tell you what type of fish you should not be eating, especially if you're within, like you're a child or you're a woman of childbearing age. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about mercury poisoning. So one of the things you may have heard of are Mad Hatters. So the Mad Hatters, when people were making hats, this was for quite some time. What they would use for hats was were using actual animal skins, so beaver skins and stuff like that. And what they used to do was they used to use urine to try to separate the hairs off of the pelt. And they found that certain people, they found this in France first, they would find that like there'd be certain workers where their urine, well, it was supposed to be camel urine in the first place, but then where the heck you're supposed to get camel urine in France? So the workers just used their own urine, or urine that they could just gather from people's houses. You used to be able to sell your urine for money, and they would find that some workers' urine worked a heck of a lot better. And it turned out that those workers who had the really good urine were being treated for syphilis, and one of the treatments for syphilis was to give the people mercury. So they were like, oh, look at this, is really great. So they were trying to use this mercury urine as much as they possibly could. And then they were like, well, why would we wait for the mercury urine? Why don't we just use mercury ourselves? Like just get some mercury and use it. So they started to use the mercury. And then because they were working in mercury all day long, it was vaporizing and they were inhaling it, and it tended to make them actually go mad. Like it causes neurological problems. It causes, oh my God, I got a list later on, I think, coming up. Oh no, I didn't put it in, sorry. But there was a list that I had that I meant to put in to show you all the problems that you have with mercury poisoning. All right, so it was only in the 1940s that they outright banned using mercury to make these felt hats. But this is where the term Mad as a Hatter come, because they literally would go crazy. They would like be shouting out. And then it was saying something I was reading, it would cause extreme shyness as well. But I don't know, you'd really see them having a lot of trouble. Okay, then in Japan in 1951, in Minamata Bay in Japan was this beautiful, beautiful area, great fishing industry. And then there was also another chemical industry that was there. And in 1951, the chemical industry changed what it was doing with its processing and started to dump the leftover processing substances into the water. That was in 1951. Anyway, so what was in that processing water was methyl mercury. So the methyl mercury, again, remember methyl mercury is one of those things that's taken up very, very easily by fish. So they were dumping this methyl mercury into the bay in Japan, which had this great fishing industry and everybody ate fish. And then about 4 years later, well, even before that, they started to notice that the cats, they would call them dancing cats. They had these cats that were like having spasms and jumping around and doing all this crazy stuff and just like, just walking along and then dropping down. There's videos of it if you ever want to look them up online. So it was crazy madness. And then, a few years later, people started to have all these spasms and like all these neurological problems and stuff as well. And then as years went on, there were babies being born that were severely disabled and were having all sorts of issues. A lot of people died from this poisoning as well, but the company was like, no, 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 it's not us, it's not us. People were shunned from each other because the people didn't know what was happening. They thought it was some type of contagious disease, and it took years and years. The company were still dumping years later when they finally had even figured out that it was the methyl mercury that the company was dumping into the lake. So horrible thing, right? So that happens way back in the 1950s, and they know about mercury poisoning. They can look and see what happens with mercury poisoning. They can look and see what happens to people who get it, as a child, who are poisoned as an adult, and babies who are poisoned as they are developing as fetuses. So they know all this problem with mercury. But still, here we are. So in Grassy Narrows, Ontario, so this is a reserve that's close to Kenora and Dryden, those places close to Winnipeg. There's a pulp and paper company that was dumping mercury into the lake from 1962 to 1970, into the river actually, sorry, not into a lake. And again, Grassy Narrows was a pretty self-sufficient reserve. They had a great fishing industry. They were able to have tourists come in and do a lot of tourist fishing and stuff like that. Like they were doing really, really well. And then all of a sudden, again, they start seeing symptoms of mercury poisoning, trying to figure out what it was. Well, it was this company that was dropping mercury into the water for 8 years there. And then it's just a scam at what they've done to Grassy Narrows. I'm going to link a video that I'd like you to watch as well afterwards by the Toronto Star. I believe they did an investigative report. It just breaks your heart. Right, what we've done to these, what companies have done to these people, and the inaction of the government to help them straighten it up. And then similarly in Walpole Island Reserve, which is down by Sarnia, we've got another area of a native reserve where from 1940 to 1976 there were 2 chemical companies that were dumping mercury into the water. And again, these are native reserves, so these people are living off the land as much as they can, and a lot of their protein is from fish. So again, Walpole Island is another place that has a problem with mercury poisoning in Ontario. Okay, so I'm going to link the video that I want you to watch separately from this, because I've had such disasters trying to make a video show during all these things. But I'm going to show you what your assignment is now. Okay, so your assignment is going to look like this. It says biomagnification and bioaccumulation. Now, the thing again is, look, with your food chains, I keep seeing the, and I know it's partially because we're not in class, so I'm, not too upset about this, but when you're showing a food chain, you have to use arrows to show which way the energy is moving. Okay, so this got a little bit of information here. It's showing you the food chain, and then you're going to be putting how many units of mercury are moving up. All right, and then there's some questions to ask here, and then some answers for you to write in here as well. All right, now the other thing is as well is when you're doing answers, we got to start working on, you guys have your literacy test next year. And I know I've seen what happens in elementary school. So I know you guys are taught punctuation. I know you guys are taught how to capitalize. I know you're taught how to do a proper sentence. I know the English teachers at school have taught you guys all this kind of stuff. So we have to start answering our questions with some good explanations that are at the grade 9 level. So when you're answering questions, capitals, punctuation, full sentences that actually make sense, no texting kind of language that's on here as well. You're going to start getting some marks for your clarity and your concise writing. All right, so that's the assignment. So at the end of this, you're going to watch the video, and then you're going to do this assignment and drop it into the Dropbox. Alrighty, and again, if you, I'll put it in Word and PDF, and you use whichever one works the best. Okay, so that's it for today's lesson. Talk to you later.